I have the honor to now give the floor to Ms. Nadia Al-Nassif, Deputy High Commissioner for Human Rights, who is here in person to make a statement. Madam, you have the floor.
Thank you. Good morning, Madam Vice President, Your Excellencies, colleagues and friends. I thank the Council for convening this special session to discuss the situation in Ethiopia, where our concerns continue to deepen, particularly in regard to the ongoing conflict, its increasingly severe impact on humanitarian needs, and the state of emergency that was adopted last month. The conflict in the Tigray region has, in recent months, extended to other areas of the country. It now involves an even wider range of actors with serious impact on civilians. The Council will recall that the report of the joint investigation on Tigray, issued by the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission and our office on 3 November, found that all parties to the conflict, including the Ethiopian National Defense Forces, Tigrayan forces, and Eritrean Defense Forces, had committed, to varying degrees, human rights violations and abuses, as well as violations of international humanitarian law and refugee law. Some of the incidents investigated could potentially amount to international crimes, including war crimes and crimes against humanity. The report advanced a number of recommendations to the government of Ethiopia and other actors, including calls on all parties to the conflict to end all violations and abuses, to take all necessary measures to protect civilians and civilian infrastructure, and to agree without preconditions to immediately end hostilities and end any measures that may exacerbate the already acute humanitarian crisis. While the government of Ethiopia expressed some reservations regarding the joint investigation's finding, it has committed to undertake comprehensive and impartial investigations into the alleged serious violations and to implement some of the report's recommendations. The Tigray People's Liberation Front and the Eritrean government entirely rejected the report and its findings. The government of Ethiopia followed up its own commitments by establishing an interministerial task force, and both our office and the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission were invited to discuss the government's plans for implementation of the joint report's recommendations. The task force has indicated areas in which it expects to require substantive support from the United Nations and intends to reach out formally to the UN partners and the international community for specific forms of support, including with respect to investigations and prosecutions. Meanwhile, the conflict has continued with ongoing fighting beyond the borders of Tigray. Our office continues to receive credible reports of severe human rights violations and abuses by all parties. The humanitarian impact of the conflict is increasingly dramatic. Acute food insecurity now affects more than 9.4 million people in northern Ethiopia, according to OCHA. Within Tigray, 5.2 million people, that is roughly 90% of the population, are in need. Only limited UN-organized humanitarian supplies have been able to enter Tigray since July, including food and vital medical supplies. In June, OCHA estimated that at least 400,000 people in Tigray were living in conditions of famine. Given the difficulty of access, no recent estimates have been released, but the situation now is likely to be even worse. The lack of access has been compounded by harassment of humanitarian workers, including NGO workers, accompanied by widespread anti-humanitarian rhetoric. Attacks against medical facilities and other essential civilian structures are extremely troubling. At least 2 million people across Tigray, Amhara, and Afar have been forced to leave their homes due to the conflict, and many of them are not receiving the assistance they need to stay alive. There are also concerns that internally displaced people might be pressured to return or relocate to areas that may be unsafe. I am also concerned about the situation of Eritrean refugees living in Ethiopia, many of whom express fear of retaliation by Eritrean forces operating in the country. Highlighting the potential regional impact of the conflict, more than 50,000 Ethiopians have led the Tigray region for East Sudan, mostly between November and December 2020, further stretching Sudan's scarce resources. The nationwide state of emergency announced on 2 November is leading to significant human rights concerns on a very broad scale. Notably, the state of emergency authorizes the arrest, search, and detention of anyone suspected of supporting the Tigray People's Liberation Front and the Oromo Liberation Army, designated terrorist groups in May 2021. This excessively broad provision has led to mass arrests and detentions of thousands of Ethiopians, including United Nations staff, and according to the Committee to Protect Journalists, at least 14 journalists. Most of those arrested are ethnic Tigrayans. Such arrests have continued in recent days. Earlier this week, OHCHR received reports of the detention of some 83 people, including 4 women, in Guji zone in the Oromia region in connection with the state of emergency. Last week, on 8 and 9 December, about 1,500 people of Tigray and Gumuz ethnicity were reportedly detained in Asoza, in Benishangul Gumuz region, also under the state of emergency. While some of those arrested over the past 6 weeks have been released, we estimate that between 5,000 and 7,000 remain detained, including 9 UN staff members. Many are detained incommunicado or in unknown locations. This is tantamount to enforced disappearance and a matter of very grave concern. Access by independent monitors has been a major challenge. Reportedly, many have been subjected to inhuman and degrading treatment and extreme overcrowding, in addition to their prolonged detention without charge, access to lawyers, or any other form of due process. I also deplore increasing hate speech and incitement to violence by federal and regional authorities, as well as other public figures, particularly targeted against Tigrayans and members of the Oromo community. Like the nationwide sweeps, house arrests, and raids, this rhetoric in public speeches, broadcasting, and social media, including Facebook and Twitter, intensifies a climate of fear. The risk of increasing hatred, violence, and discrimination is very high and could escalate into generalized violence. This could have major implications not only for millions of people in Ethiopia, but also across the region. Excellencies, all parties to the conflict must take immediate action to end the conflict, to protect civilians and put an end to the continuing human rights violations and abuses being committed against the people of Ethiopia. Humanitarian workers must urgently be permitted rapid, safe, and unimpeded passage to assist all civilians in need in Tigray and other conflict-affected areas. Their dignity, impartiality, and independence should be respected, and discussions of humanitarian needs and assistance should be depoliticized. Any form of harassment of humanitarian workers should be condemned. I strongly urge reassessment by all parties of the immediate and long-term damage that is being done to a nation that is justly proud of its unique place in human history and its recent advances in infrastructure, development, and human dignity. I encourage all parties to pull back from a posture of war and, for the sake of the lives and human rights of Ethiopia's people, to immediately end hostilities without preconditions. I also urge all parties to participate in a meaningful and inclusive dialogue at national level, both through the National Dialogue Commission, once it has been formally established, and in the context of the African Union's mediation efforts. I reiterate that the government should take immediate action to ensure that measures under the state of emergency fully comply with the country's commitments under international human rights law. Recent actions by the authorities in the context of the state of emergency appear inconsistent with the government's expressed commitment to implement the recommendations of the Joint Investigation Report. Our office, for its part, is ready to assist the government with specific guidance in these areas. Notably, all people detained under the state of emergency must continue to be treated fully consistently with international standards, including knowledge of the grounds of detention as well as of any charges against them and prompt and fair trial. Independent monitors, including the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission, should be permitted access to all detention facilities. The government's establishment of a domestic mechanism to implement human rights recommendations is a step forward, and it will be important to operationalize and give genuine effect to the stated commitment for meaningful accountability for victims. I note that, for example, stated commitments to investigate cases of sexual and gender-based violence and to prosecute perpetrators have fallen short, both in transparency and effectiveness. We will continue to work with the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission and to support genuine efforts by the authorities to advance accountability for violations committed in the context of the conflict in Tigray and elsewhere across the country. The onus is on the state to discharge its primary responsibility to deliver fair and independent proceedings that address the full range of violations identified, not only isolated individual instances, and to take into consideration applicable command responsibility. Without significant accountability efforts, an international mechanism could be an important complement. Thank you.
I thank you for your statement.
85 years ago, right here in Geneva, a firm committed believer in the principle of collective security and world peace, His Majesty Emperor Haile Selassie's appeal to the League of Nations could not convince multilateralism to end the Italian aggression. History repeats itself. Today, 85 years later, here in Geneva, Ethiopia is once again defending its sovereignty and territorial integrity, this time from internal aggression. This time as well, our commitment to multilateralism is not helping us to defend our country. Multilateralism, after all these years, is once again being hijacked by a neo-colonialist mentality. Ethiopia is being targeted and singled out at the Human Rights Council for defending a democratically elected government, the peace and the future of its people. As one of the founders of the League of Nations, the UN, Ethiopia is a firm believer in multilateralism. The mandate and work of Human Rights Council is not to advance ulterior political objectives. In recent years, we have seen the same powers oversee the complete destabilization of several countries. This must stop. In the past, we stood alone to defend colonial aggression. Today, Ethiopia confronts this blatant political pressure with other many countries shoulder to defend multilateralism. Deputy High Commissioner, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission have jointly investigated the alleged human rights violations in the context of the conflict in the northern part of Ethiopia. Ethiopia has a government with unreserved commitment to human rights. We declared our commitment to implement the recommendations of the recently issued joint investigation and set up national mechanism and interministerial task force. The task force has started its work. It would have been ready to cooperate with the Office of the High Commissioner on some areas required additional expertise. The government of Ethiopia has once again invited the Office of the High Commissioner to jointly investigate the serious violations in the Afar and Amara regions together with the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission, starting from the period the first joint investigation ended. The initiative of this special session, on the other hand, failed to condemn the pillage, destruction of property, rape and sexual abuse, use of child soldier by the rebel forces, the TPLF. This terrorist group commanded more than 1,000 trucks delivering humanitarian supplies to the people in Tigray region and used them for military purpose. It destroyed food warehouses, schools, health facilities, industrial parks. The initiators of this special session would not care less. They are determined to impose their will on the government. The very underhand manner this special session was initiated shows the ulterior political objective. Is this initiative helpful? No. Why would one want to establish a concurrent body with the same mandate of the joint investigation team? Why is a request table to investigate an already investigated in the reported matter, which is now currently under implementation? Is the Human Rights Council putting into question the report that it has already adopted, or is it undermining thriving national mechanism? The answer is clear. The Council is being used as an instrument of political pressure. It is a counterproductive effort to embolden the terrorist rebels and exacerbate the situation on the ground. Therefore, the right thing to do is to support our genuine national efforts consistent with principle of subsidiarity. As far as Ethiopia is concerned, rest assured that my government will continue to ensure accountability. In light of the foregoing, the government of Ethiopia expressed its complete rejection of resolution A/HRC/S-33/L. We call upon council members to firm principled stand against short-sighted interest and the refused politicization of human rights by rejecting this resolution. I would like to reiterate that my government will not cooperate with any mechanism that may be imposed on it, because this is not only a deliberate destabilization effort, but
Ambassador, I am so sorry, but I must interrupt. You have exhausted the 5 minutes, but I thank you for your statement. We'll now hear from the next council member, Slovenia, on behalf of the European Union via Zoom.
Madam Vice President, I have the honor to speak on behalf of the European Union. For over a year, the European Union has been following the developments in Ethiopia with great concern. In recent months, the conflict has further worsened and expanded. The gravity and scale of violations and atrocities committed against civilians by all sides, including sexual and gender-based violence and ethnic violence, is unacceptable. The humanitarian situation is disastrous in many parts of the country, with millions of people in the need of life-saving support. The European Union remains convinced that there is no military solution to this crisis. We reaffirm our strong support for African Union and regional mediation efforts led by High Representative Obasanjo. The widespread targeting of ethnic groups, hate speech, and incitement should be of the utmost concern. In this regard, the European Union calls for transparency on the situation of persons arrested since the declaration of the state of emergency, including by allowing visits to detention facilities. The European Union has welcomed the joint report and called for further investigations. We are encouraged by the steps taken by the Ethiopian authorities to follow up on the report's findings. We regret that Eritrea and the TPLF have not shown willingness to take up the report's recommendations. Human rights violations and abuses and violations of international humanitarian and refugee laws unfortunately continue to be committed by all parties in all areas affected by the conflict. A number of violations may amount to crimes against humanity and war crimes and urgently require further investigations by independent experts. We believe that the establishment of an independent international investigative mechanism will enable, inter alia, to build upon the findings of the joint report. It is urgent and necessary to complement national efforts and ensure accountability. All efforts should focus on helping bring peace and justice to Ethiopia and its people. The European Union's hope remains to adopt the resolution by consensus with the support of the countries concerned. I thank you.
Thank you. We'll now hear from Belgium on behalf of a group of countries by way of video statement.
The Benelux countries align themselves with the statement presented by the EU. The conflict in Ethiopia has come at the expense of civilians, whose rights were gravely violated or abused. It is the responsibility of the Human Rights Council to respond. According to its mandate, the Human Rights Council should protect human rights for all, without distinction, and should address situations where human rights are violated. The special session should not be construed as an attack on the sovereignty or territorial integrity of Ethiopia. On the contrary, we consider the promotion of respect of human rights of all people living in Ethiopia a precondition for the prosperous future of the country. The Joint Investigation Team report of November and the statement of the High Commissioner made clear that all parties to the conflict have committed human rights violations and abuses. Systematic violations of human rights, including ethnic targeting, continue to this day, also beyond the scope of the report with regard to both geography and time. All parties to the conflict must realize that fanning the flames of ethnic hatred risks leading to large-scale ethnic violence. Urgent action is needed to ensure that those responsible for the vicious circle of atrocities are held to account. Our country is welcome in that regard the recent decision of the Ethiopian government to set up an interministerial task force in response to the human rights violations and call for the swift implementation of its mandate. With its action today, the Human Rights Council strives to ensure that reports of serious violations and abuses are investigated and documented, and that further independent monitoring will take place to protect Ethiopian civilians and complement the national efforts and regional action by the African Union. This will be in the interest of both Ethiopia and the region at large. The Benelux countries support the tabled resolution and encourage all members of this council to vote in its favor. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll now hear from the distinguished representative of Cameroon on behalf of the African Group.
Thank you, Madame President. Madame la Présidente, je prends la parole au nom du groupe africain pour exprimer la position du groupe sur l'opportunité d'une session spéciale sur la situation des droits de l'homme en Éthiopie et sur le projet de la résolution en examen. Le groupe africain réaffirme fermement son attachement au multilatéralisme et son engagement constructif et sans réserve à la protection et à la promotion des droits de l'homme dans le monde. À cet égard, le groupe rassure les membres du Conseil de sa pleine coopération avec l'ensemble des mécanismes onusiens et autres en matière de droits de l'homme. Le groupe africain déplore cependant, en ce qui concerne l'initiative qui nous réunit aujourd'hui, à savoir la session spéciale sur la situation des droits de l'homme en Éthiopie, que les initiateurs, notamment ses partenaires de l'Union européenne, aient totalement ignoré ses positions et ses conseils sur cette délicate question. Tout comme ont été ignorés les efforts appréciables du gouvernement éthiopien, de la Commission nationale des droits de l'homme de ce pays, qui ont mené une enquête conjointe avec le bureau du haut-commissaire sur les violations des droits de l'homme et du droit humanitaire, et dont les autorités éthiopiennes procèdent actuellement à l'établissement des faits de responsabilité. Le groupe africain regrette également l'indifférence manifestée à la pertinente initiative régionale de médiation commune sur le terrain de l'Union africaine à travers le président Olusegun Obasanjo. À cet égard, le groupe africain considère que le principe de complémentarité doit être respecté dans une conduite apaisée des relations internationales et toute politisation du processus d'enquête doit être évitée. Il en est de même de toute manœuvre susceptible de déboucher sur une politisation du Conseil. Le groupe africain considère que la nature du conflit en Éthiopie n'est ni plus ni moins que la déstabilisation d'un État souverain et la déconstruction de la démocratie. Le groupe africain s'oppose vigoureusement à tout processus susceptible d'être interprété comme donnant l'onction à la fragmentation des États. Le groupe africain réaffirme solennellement que le processus du Conseil soit plus que jamais guidé par un engagement constructif, dépouillé de toute politisation et conseille les initiateurs de cette résolution de la reconsidérer dans l'intérêt de la paix, de la promotion des droits de l'homme et de la stabilité de l'Éthiopie. En conclusion, le groupe africain considère que le mécanisme que voudrait mettre sur place la résolution en débat est contre-productif et susceptible d'exacerber les tensions. Il appelle par conséquent les membres du Conseil à le rejeter. Au regard de ce qui précède,
I'm sorry, Ambassador, you have exhausted your time. but I thank you for your statement. And we'll now hear from the distinguished representative of Somalia, who will address the Council in person. Thank you.
Thank you, Vice President. Somalia is aligned with the African Group statement presented on the situation of the human rights in Ethiopia. We congratulate the government of Ethiopia and its people for steps taken to vote democratically, secure its peace within its border, and advance the interest of its people. Somalia noted with satisfaction and support the positive process and progress of ongoing investigation on a joint investigation team of the Ethiopian Rights Commission and the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for the Human Rights. The joint investigation team should be interested to conclude the investigation it's made respect and be given the time without due pressure or parallel process. Somalia is concerned about the new proposal of setting up another body with same mandate of a joint investigation team of the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission. This will be counterproductive to the current processes to support victims and survivors. It's made hinder the inter-processes to advance the human rights situation in Ethiopia. With that note, my delegation does not support this resolution and the new proposal of the situation in the human rights in Ethiopia. Somalia will vote against and calls on other members of the Council to do the same. Thank you, Vice President.
Thank you. We'll now hear from the distinguished representative of Namibia via a video statement.
Namibia aligns herself with a statement delivered on behalf of the African Group, and we take this opportunity to deliver a few remarks in our national capacity. Madam President, the primary responsibility to promote, protect, and fulfill human rights lies with the state. All international efforts should complement and not substitute the efforts of the state aimed at executing this responsibility. Namibia has in the past placed on record that mechanisms such as the one envisaged by the outcome of this special session should only be deployed where the state concerned is unwilling and unable to address the human rights concerns and to hold perpetrators accountable. In the case of Ethiopia, we have a state that has cooperated with the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights in the joint investigations that were carried out with the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission. The state concerned has also accepted the recommendations of the joint investigations and proceeded to establish national mechanisms to try and address the human rights concerns that emanate from the ongoing conflict. It is our understanding that the Ethiopian government has again invited the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights to continue reporting and monitoring beyond the June 2021 period. Given these developments, it is beyond our comprehension why this council is called upon to assume that the Ethiopian government may not be able to address the human rights concerns and to hold perpetrators accountable, notwithstanding the national mechanisms that have been created for this purpose. It is our submission that this Council's action should be based on factual conclusions rather than the assumptions that the state concerned may not be able to address the human rights concerns and hold perpetrators accountable. We conclude that the creation of the proposed international investigative mechanism is not compatible with a complementary principle and could undermine the efforts of national institutions. Namibia can therefore not support the creation of the envisaged mechanism at this stage. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished ambassador of Namibia. We'll now hear from the distinguished representative of Eritrea on Zoom.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. Let me on the onset put on record that the outrageous caught by the coordinator of the special procedure is unfair, baseless, and based on dubious source. It's neither in the culture of our disciplined defense forces nor in our policy to clean Tigrayans from their own country. Madam Vice President, the convening of this special session is regrettably part of the ongoing abuse of the principles of human rights and the working method of the Council. In less than 6 months, the Council was called several times to discuss the human rights situation in the Tigray region of Ethiopia, including through briefings and interim briefings of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. Sadly, the deliberations aim at deflecting the attention of the Council from the real human rights violations that has happened in Ethiopia. The attempts all focus on one region, while excluding the rest of Ethiopia in terms of coverage, and they aim at shifting the blame to others to acquit the main culprit. In this vein, it's important to reiterate again that the Council does not remain ambivalent on the misguided action that has emboldened the TPLF to resort to military adventure through even using UN trucks that were allowed to deliver aid to the needy. The special session is thus unfair, unbalanced, and undermines the UN Charter-based responsibilities based on sovereign governments to restore law and order in times of crisis to defend their territorial integrity. Eritrea continues to reject the ongoing attempts to downplay the horrific attack on the Northern Command of Ethiopia Federal Forces and indiscriminate rocket shelling on Eritrean cities. In conclusion, it's unacceptable to see some states continue to depend on a protracted disinformation campaign aiming at scapegoating Eritrea and covering up the essence of the crisis. I thank you, Madam Vice President.
I thank the distinguished representative. We'll now hear from the distinguished representative of Nigeria on Zoom.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. Nigeria aligns with the statements delivered by the British representative of Cameroon on behalf of the African Group and that of the government of Ethiopia to oppose the convening of a special session by this Council on the human rights situation in Ethiopia. We call for this special session in the disregard for the sovereignty and political independence of Ethiopia, and indeed an outright dismissal of the commitment and efforts of the government of Ethiopia in the implementation of the recommendations contained in the recent report of the Joint Investigation Team. It is very pertinent to highlight that the decision by some member states to convene this special session without recourse to ongoing continental efforts and progress made to peacefully resolve the conflict in Ethiopia is very unhelpful. We are of the view that actions such as this only undermine continental mediation efforts, including the engagement of the High Representative of the Chairman of the African Union Commission. The delegation of Nigeria remains resolute that, notwithstanding the nomenclature, any attempt to interfere in the internal politics of Ethiopia through the creation of another human rights mandate or mechanism is counterproductive and should neither be encouraged nor find room within this Council. We therefore call on members of this esteemed Council to support the government of Ethiopia in its efforts to achieve a peaceful resolution of the conflict by opposing any decision or action that could escalate the already dire situation in the country. I thank you, Madam Vice President.
Thank you. We'll now hear from the distinguished representative of South Africa on Zoom.
Madam Vice President, South Africa expresses its deep concern about the ongoing situation in Ethiopia.
South Africa?
I'm sorry. Could you please continue, Ambassador?
Madam Vice President, South Africa expresses its deep concern about the ongoing situation in Ethiopia, notably the escalating conflict, the serious allegations of human rights violations, and the worsening humanitarian crisis. We call on all parties to cease hostilities and conduct themselves in accordance with their solemn obligation under international human rights law and humanitarian law. We reiterate our support for the mediation efforts undertaken by President Obasanjo, the AU envoy, and urge all parties to cooperate towards finding a durable, peaceful solution to the conflict. South Africa believes that there is ample scope for dialogue among all parties and calls on them to work towards creating conditions, including the necessary cessation of hostilities that will pave the way towards an inclusive political dialogue. It is a political solution, not a military one, that will bring about lasting peace, stability, and development for all people of Ethiopia. We welcome the decision of the Ethiopian government to accept and implement the recommendations contained in the reports of the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission and the Office of the High Commissioner, which were published last month. We urge other parties to also accept and implement these recommendations. We call on all parties to provide unhindered humanitarian access to affected areas, particularly the Tigray region. We reaffirm our solidarity with the people of Ethiopia during this difficult time and confirm our readiness to provide support as may be required. I thank you, Madam Vice President.
Thank you, Ambassador.
We will now begin consideration of draft resolution A/HRC/S33/L1. I give the floor to the representative of Slovenia to introduce the draft resolution on behalf of the European Union on Zoom.
Thank you. Mr. Vice President, I have the honor to present on behalf of the European Union draft resolution L1 as orally revised, entitled Situation of Human Rights in Ethiopia. From the beginning, our aim was to present a constructive and well-balanced resolution, urging all parties to the conflict to respect their obligations under international law, acknowledging and building upon the positive developments that have already taken place, and contributing to accountability efforts via the establishment of an independent international investigative mechanism. The text also reiterates our firm commitment to the territorial integrity and unity of Ethiopia, as well as our support to the ongoing mediation efforts led by the African Union. This is a resolution about the respect of human rights and fundamental values that we should all share and defend. Mr. Vice President, our decision to call for a special session was not taken hastily or lightly, but only after careful consideration and thorough consultations with delegations from all regions. We strove to adopt the same transparent and inclusive approach in preparing the draft before you. We thank all the delegations who engaged constructively during the informal consultations and bilaterally. Our text has certainly benefited from their good suggestions in many places. We appreciated the opportunity to engage with the country concerned and regret that we were not able to engage substantively on the text, in line with the inclusive approach that we have always favored. It was never our intention to single out one party, nor to undervalue in any way domestic accountability mechanisms as we distinctly expressed in our text. And yet, in light of the prolonged conflict situation and given the seriousness of the allegations, it is clear to us that the international community has to assume its responsibilities and that this Council has to fulfill its mandated role, including with regard to prevention. Mr. Vice President, this resolution and the mechanism it proposes are, in our view, a positive and necessary contribution and complementary addition to ongoing efforts for peace and justice for the people of Ethiopia. We thus call upon all members of this Council to adopt this resolution by consensus. I thank you.
Thank you. We shall now hear from the country concerned. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Ethiopia. Excellency, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. We are appalled by the way some of the interventions were made before this August Assembly. They do not comprehend the gravity of the allegation they carry in misleading the international community. The accusations leveled against my country are unfounded and disregard the facts on the ground. We hate to remind those who took the floor that the finding of the Office of the High Commissioner and Ethiopian Human Rights Commission joint investigation did not find evidence to support the claims of deliberate or willful denial of humanitarian assistance to the civilian population in Tigray or the use of starvation as a weapon of war. In fact, humanitarian assistance has been flowing if it were not for the rebel group commanding more than 1,000 trucks. We sincerely believe that these polemics will only exacerbate the situation on the ground. Therefore, we urge all in this regard to refrain from making political statements before a Human Rights Council. Let us also once again underline that we do not see any merit in this politically motivated draft resolution. Let me conclude by appreciating all nations who allied with the African Group statement for their principled stand. Ethiopia is firmly committed to peace and human rights. I thank you.
I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Eritrea.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. As already made it clear, this resolution does not enjoy the support of the concerned states and neither the support of the African Group. Therefore, we will be voting against the resolution and we will call a vote on this resolution. Thank you.
Thank you. At the request of the delegation of Eritrea, the Council will now proceed to a vote on the draft resolution AHRC S33L1 as orally revised. I invite the members of the Council to log out and log in again on eDelegate at this moment to ensure that delegations are not locked out by the system for security reasons while the vote is taking place. Please note that your vote will appear on the screen with a 4 to 6 seconds delay. A delegation not intending to cast any vote is invited to inform the Secretariat. I now ask the Secretariat to activate the vote on eDelegate, and I request all delegations to register their vote. I invite members of the Council to click on the refresh button on the top left-hand side of the screen in case the draft resolution does not appear on their screen. Have all delegations registered their vote? It seems to be the case. I request delegations to check whether their vote is accurately reflected on their screen. If this is the case, I ask the Secretariat to close the vote now. The voting is now closed. The results of the recorded votes are as follows. In favor, 21, 15 against, 11 abstentions. Draft resolution AHRC S33L1 entitled Situation of Human Rights in Ethiopia as orally revised is therefore adopted.